Welcome to our next lesson for second semester Greek. This is now lesson 4, and in this particular lesson we're going to be looking at aorist participles. We began looking at participles in the last lesson, focusing on present and future participles, and this time we'll look just at the aorist form of participles, but in all three voices, active, middle, and passive voice. And then we'll also look at the issue of timing of action with participles and expand on that, as well as expand on the issue of the time of action with indicative mood verbs and compare that with participles. And then we're going to close this lesson by looking at a unique construction, an idiom of Greek called the genitive absolute construction. But before we begin all of those subjects, let's just take a moment to review our vocabulary for this lesson. Okay, let's begin our vocabulary list with a proper name at the top. You see the name for Abraham, the patriarch of the Old Testament, and it's pronounced Ha-Abraham, Ha-Abraham. And what we have here is the definite article before Abraham. Of course, you know it's masculine because he was masculine, a man. But again, we see, as with other names we've studied in our vocabulary list, that proper names in Greek often take, in fact, usually take the definite article before them, unlike we have in English. We don't say the Tom or the barb, etc. The next word down on our list is the adjective for eternal, and it's pronounced aionios in the masculine, or when it's a neuter adjective, it's aionion. What's interesting to note about this word is, it's an adjective, just should be translated eternal, but it's related to a word we've already studied in previous vocabulary lists, the noun aion, meaning age. And keep in mind that when aion is put in the plural, aionos, especially in a prepositional phrase, eis tous aionos, literally unto the ages, it idiomatically means forever in Greek. Or sometimes it's a double plural, eis tous aionos ton aionon, unto the ages of the ages, literally. But we would translate that idiomatically to mean forever and ever. And so all of those imply eternity. They're all eternal in quality. They're just different ways of expressing that. And so aionos, the adjective, is related to aion. That's what you should keep in mind. The next word down on the list is the word for a scribe, ha grammateus in the nominative, or in the genitive, grammateos. The next word down is the word for I persecute or I pursue. It's dioko. And after that is the word for nation, singular, or nations, plural, Gentiles, it could be translated in the plural. It's the word ta ethnos in the nominative, or in the genitive, it would be ethnous. But this word, you should note, when it's in the singular, just translate it nations. When it's in the, or nation, and sometimes ethnos by itself is in reference to the nation Israel. When Jesus says, is there such great faith in this nation I have not found? Singular, when it's used that way, it can be used for Israel. But when it's in the plural, ethnoi, it's clearly in reference to nations, and thus we can translate it either nations or Gentiles. It's similar to the Hebrew word in the Old Testament, goy, which singularly means nation and can be in reference to Israel. But when it's in the plural, goyim, it almost always refers to the nations, the Gentiles. And similarly, another Hebrew word, am, means people in the singular, or amim in the plural is peoples. And when it's put in the plural, it's in reference to the peoples outside of the people of Israel. So similar concept when you come to the New Testament and you see this word ethnos in the singular, or ethnoi in the plural. The next word after that is the word enopion, which means before. It's a preposition. And oftentimes this phrase or word is used with the idea of before God, or in the presence of God. Enopion, like in the sight of God, that we're all, because he's all-knowing and he sees all, it's as though we're right there before him in his presence. So you often see enopion used with that truth in the New Testament. After that, we see the word for Jerusalem, but it's found in two different spellings, and there's a reason for that. The first spelling is pronounced with a rough breathing, and it's preceded either by the article ta or he. Either one, you'll find it spelled like this. The rough breathing is pronounced hi'arasaluma, hi'arasaluma. And this is a word that occurs about 33 times or so. The word for Jerusalem occurs about 100 times in the New Testament, and about a third of the time it has this spelling here, hi'arasaluma. And the reason we have this spelling is because of Hellenization, it's called. That is where words that were Hebrew originally, like the word for Jerusalem, Yerushalayim in Hebrew, when that was put into Greek, it became Hellenized. In other words, they changed the sound of it to match how a Greek speaker would pronounce the word. And it sounded similar to the Greeks, to their word for holy or something pertaining to the temple, to the word hieros, hieros. And so they gave it a rough breathing pronunciation about a third of the time, and then a smooth breathing pronunciation for the other 2/3 of its occurrences in the New Testament. And that's the spelling below, at the very bottom, with the smooth breathing, which is Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem is how it should be pronounced. It's a tongue twister. Next on our vocabulary list is a verb meaning I sit down, kathemai, and its deponent. So in other words, it has a middle and passive voice spelling, but it is active in its function. That's how we should treat it. And after that is the word for may, which means not. And this is the form of word that you would use for negating something or not. It's used with moods that are not the indicative mood. Remember, we saw another word that also means not, and that is the word u, omicron upsilon, used for indicative mood uses. But when you've got a verb in the context that it's modifying that is not an indicative mood, so subjunctive mood, imperative mood, etc., or optative mood, you would then use in Greek the word may. Also, below that, you see a similar term, mede, mede. Now, mede means and not, just as you put the two words together, de with may, it literally means and not. You could translate it nor or not even. And sometimes you see mede, and then several words later, mede used again. And when that construction occurs, you want to translate it neither nor. After that is the word for face, ta prosopan, and this is similar to that idea of enopion we saw earlier in our vocabulary list. So before his face is sometimes an expression used of being before God, in the sight of God, and so you see these two terms used quite frequently with that concept of being before God in his sight. The next word down is a very common word that's used in the Gospels, especially in Acts, where it speaks of a sign that is done by the Lord Jesus Christ. In fact, in John's Gospel, he uses this term almost exclusively for the miracles that Jesus did. And many other signs did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, he writes in John chapter 20 in the purpose statement for the book. But here, the word for sign is pronounced ta semeon, ta semeon. The next word down is a proper name again, and it's two forms of the spelling for the name of Simon. And again, the definite article used before a proper name there. So ha Simon, or Simonas in the genitive case. After that is the word for mouth, and it's ta stoma, or stomatos in the genitive. Now we think stomach when we see that word, but just keep in mind that the mouth precedes the stomach. What goes into the stomach has to go through the mouth, and that's how I associate those two. So stoma does not mean stomach, it actually means mouth. After that is the word for synagogue, He synagoge is how we would pronounce it, and it's virtually transliterated into English as synagogue. After that is the word for water, ta hudor in the nominative, or huditas in the genitive. Next on our list of vocabulary words corresponding to our textbook by Ray Summers is the list for chapter 22. And so let's start at the top with the A's again. We have apoluo, which means I release or dismiss. Apoluo is a term that's used sometimes for like a prisoner being released. Barabbas was released, and the word there is apoluo, instead of Jesus being released. It sometimes can be translated dismiss or send away. In fact, this term apoluo is used in context of a divorce where a man puts away or sends away his wife. So that's the word there. The next word is espadzamai, which means I greet. And you see this quite frequently in the epistles where greetings are extended from the writer to the readers. And it's deponent again. The next word down is epithumia. He epithumia, it's feminine, and it refers to a desire, a longing. It could be a sinful desire, or it could be a positive desire. Epithumia is neutral, but just keep in mind it simply means a desire. It could be positive desire for the things of the Lord, or negative. It does not inherently mean something sinful or bad. The next word down is the term for time or season. It's ha-kairos, and this is going to be distinguished from another vocabulary word we'll have in a moment, chronos. But kairos refers to an opportune time, a proper time or opportune time. It's qualitative time. In other words, vying up an opportunity, like in Ephesians 5:16, it's the word that's used there is kairos, for redeeming the time, redeeming the kairos, buying up every opportunity to serve the Lord is the idea. Next on the list is the word for a group that remains, that's left over, the others, the rest, or the remaining group is the idea. Loipos in the masculine, loipe, loipon in the feminine, in the neuter. And this is related to the verb for lepo, I leave. It's just spelled differently in the stem there, loip instead of lep, but they're two similar concepts. The next word down is the word for blessed. This is the term that's used throughout the Gospels for those who received a blessing. Especially think of Matthew chapter 5 with the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. This is a term that's used quite a bit. It's pronounced makarios, or makaria, makarion in the feminine and neuter. After that is the term for middle. It's the word mesos. Again, it can be spelled all three ways depending on its masculine, feminine, or neuter. After that is the word for poor, ptokos, ptoke, ptokon, and this is in reference to people who are poor, or a quality of being poor. It's in contrast to rich, plusios, which is another term you see in the New Testament. Sometimes it helps to memorize some of these words by their synonyms or antonyms, and I like to contrast these terms somehow, or oftentimes, and it helps me to remember them a little better. Ptokos is poor, and plusios is rich. The rest of the words on our vocabulary list are at the top there, ta sabaton, and of course you can see by the spelling, if you were to transliterate that, it looks very similar to Sabbath, and that is what the word means, Sabbath. The next word after that is a word you definitely need to know. It's the word for salvation, he soteria. Sozo is the verb form, I save, but salvation, the noun form, would be soteria. And a savior is a soter, and so you can see all these terms are related to one another. After that is the word for need, he krea. When someone has a need, he krea is the term. After that is the word for time, or a period of time, that is in reference to chronological or sequential time. In other words, quantitative time, time understood quantitatively, not qualitatively. Remember, qualitative time, opportune time, was kairos. Here it's chronos, and it's easy to see. Again, transliterating it, this is where we get chronology. And so think of sequential or chronological time. This is the word that's used in Hebrews 5, verse 12, where it speaks of by the time you ought to be teachers. In other words, there's been some chronological time that's elapsed, and you backsliding Hebrew Christians should have grown by now to the point where you could be teachers, but you need to be taught the elementary truths of the Word of God all over again. So that's the idea in Hebrews 5:12. It's also used in Hebrews 11:32, where it says, time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah. In other words, quantitative time. I don't have time. I don't have minutes or seconds to tell you any more. I have to get on. And so that's the distinction between chronos and kairos. Very important terms. The next word down is od, or ode, hode. It's got the rough breathing, and it's the idea of here or in this place. The next word after that is the word for hour, he hora, and so it's a noun, and it refers to an hour or some time, a moment of time. It could be a literal hour of time, or it could be in reference to a period of time, not literally 1 hour per se. So for instance, in Matthew 8, verse 13, it speaks of the centurion's servant who was healed in that same hour, and hora is used there. And there, obviously, it's in reference to a particular hour, or it could be used more broadly in a figurative way, like it is in 1 John 2:18, where it says, many antichrists have come, by which we know that it is the last hour. Well, obviously, it's not in reference to one 60-minute period, because that last hour that John speaks of has lasted from his day to our day. The word that's last on our list here is the word hosta, and it means so that or therefore. And just think of John 3:16. That's where this word appears, hosta. For God so loved the world, hosta, so that he gave his only begotten Son. That's the word that's used right in John 3:16. And that's it for our vocabulary list for this lesson. Now, before we move on to look at participles, and in particular aorist participles, let's just review for a moment the range of options grammatically that we have with verbs versus participles. With verbs, we have tense, and you can see all 6 tenses possible there. Now, not every word occurs in all 6 tense forms in the New Testament, but at least we know that verbs in general are found in 6 different tense forms, 3 different voices, active, middle, passive, and 4 different moods, indicative, imperative, subjunctive, optative. They're also found in first, second, and third person, first person I, second person you, third person he, she, or it in the singular. And then number, verbs have number, either singular or plural. Now, by contrast, when we look at participles, they also have tense, present, future, aorist, and perfect, but 2 tense forms have dropped out from the verb form to the participle form. We no longer have imperfect tense or pluperfect tense forms for participles. Likewise, when it comes to participles, they share all 3 voices, active, middle, and passive, but what they don't have is mood. There is no participle mood. There's not indicative, imperative, subjunctive, optative, etc. So when you speak of participles, just keep in mind that there is no mood for participles, just like with infinitives. They are non-finite verbs, or verbal forms, I should say, verbals, and so they don't have mood. But they do have case, because keep in mind that participles are a verbal adjective, so they have the case forms, nominative or genitive, ablative, dative, or in the 8-case system, dative, locative, instrumental, and accusative. So they will appear in those forms. And because they are an adjectival, a verbal adjective, and they function like adjectives, they're going to have the same case endings of the 3 declensions that the nouns and adjectives and pronouns use. So there's agreement there, you'll see. And of course they have gender. They can be masculine, feminine, or neuter, and participles are also singular or plural. Now let's look at our aorist tense participle forms, starting with the aorist active voice tense forms. And here we have genitive case, in this case here with the 2 words used in yellow there, lucentas and lusaces. And this slide helps us to see the component parts to the aorist active participle. And so with lucentas, to begin with, this is genitive in its case, so it has the os ending. It's singular, it's masculine for first aorist active participle of luo. And you see the stem with the lambda upsilon. The other component part is the sigma alpha combination there. This is the first aorist tense suffix that comes after the stem. So lusa. And then you have the active voice participle sign, which is either nu tau or in the masculine or the sigma in the feminine. And then you just simply attach the case endings, os or ace in this case. So the component parts are the stem, the aorist tense suffix, which is sigma alpha, and then the active voice participle sign or infix, it's sometimes called, the nu tau combination or the sigma, and then the case endings, either third declension ending for masculine, first declension ending for feminine, or third declension endings for neuter, just like we would see with the nouns, pronouns, and adjectives. Now, having looked at the component parts to the aorist active participle forms in the previous slide, let's look here at the paradigm now for the first aorist active participle of luo. With masculine, feminine, and neuter forms, you'll see under each column, on the left side of each gender, you'll see the singular, and to the right of that, the plural forms. So lusas is the masculine nominative singular. Lusantes, would be the plural nominative masculine plural, and so forth. And then they're just declined accordingly. And I've provided, again, no translation for each of these simple statements because there's just too much variety of usage for participles. You really have to put these in a context before you can give a proper translation. Even though luo means I loose, we can't say that lusas in every case means loosing. There's a variety of words that are often added to that depending on how it's used. So the component parts, again, you can see right here in this paradigm, they all have the stem, lu, lambda upsilon, and then after that you see the first aorist tense suffix, which is sigma alpha. They all have that, whether masculine, feminine, or neuter, but it varies a little after that now. Now you see the active voice participle sign or infix of the nu tau combination for the masculine and neuter. However, when it comes to the feminine columns, notice that the active voice participle sign is a sigma rather than the nu tau under the feminine there. And then after that, you're just left with the case endings, which in the instance of the masculine, with the genitive singular os or e or a, or in the plural for the masculine s, on, in, or os. They follow a pattern. For the case endings, for the masculine column, you've got third declension endings used. The same thing with the neuter, those follow a third declension ending system. But for the feminine, they use first declension endings. Lusasa, lusases, lusase, lusasan, lusasai, lusason, lusasais, and lusasas. So the pattern for masculine, feminine, and neuter here is third, first, and third. It's a 3-1-3 declension ending pattern. You could probably write 3-1-3 in your in your textbook right above these paradigms. So that was the first aorist active voice forms. Now let's look at first aorist middle voice participle formation. And it's very similar. You've got the stem here with lu, and then the first aorist tense suffix, sigma alpha combination, but then it varies a little bit. With the middle voice now, you have the men, mu epsilon nu, middle voice participle sign. Whether it's masculine or feminine, they're going to use the same middle voice sign now. And then you just attach the endings, the case endings, u or ace in this case, for the genitive forms of luo in the participle. Now here is the paradigm or paradigms for the middle voice form of the first aorist participle. Having seen its component parts again for the middle voice, let's just identify them now, whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter. You'll see they all have the same stem, lu, lambda, upsilon, and after that stem comes the suffix, first aorist tense suffix, which is sigma alpha in its combination, and that's true for masculine, feminine, and neuter. They all share that. Likewise, they all share the middle voice participle sign or infix of mu epsilon nu, men. Whether it's masculine, feminine, neuter, they all share that. How they differ, though, is just in their endings or their case endings. For the masculine, you've got second declension. Neuter is also second declension. And feminine is first declension endings. So you've got a 2-1-2 pattern as far as case endings go. Okay, so we've seen the first aorist active and middle voice participle forms. Now we're looking at the first aorist passive participle forms. So passive voice here, again, masculine, feminine, and neuter. And they're very similar. You just have the stem, lu again. And this time you've got the theta added here, which is often a cue or a tip that you are looking at a passive voice form. Remember, with the future, passive, indicative, and the first aorist passive indicative, it used the theta as a sign of a passive voice form. Well, the same is true here when it comes to participles. So you've got the theta. Often the theta epsilon combination occurs, or theta epsilon and iota together. And there's some contraction, and so sometimes it's just theta eta here. And then after that, you've got, again, your nu tau combination, or a sigma, and then just your case endings. And the case endings follow a 3-1-3 pattern in the case of the passive participle, which would be third declension for the masculine, first declension for the feminine, third declension for the neuter. Now we've seen the first aorist participle forms for active, middle, and passive voice, and we used luo as our root word. But now we're going to move on to second aorist participle forms. And second aorist forms for the participle function exactly the same way as first aorist participles function. We'll get to function and meaning in just a moment. But first, let's look at their forms. In this case, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on second aorist forms, but we have the second aorist active here for lepo, meaning I leave. And you'll notice that when it comes to the aorist participle form, there's been a contraction that occurs in the stem, so it's no longer lep, but it's lip. And so there's been a change there. But the good news is that once that contraction has occurred, then all you have are the participle endings that are exactly the same as the present active participle forms. So lipon, lipantas, lipanti, lipanta, lipantes, lipanton, lipusin, lipantas. And then the same for feminine and same for neuter. They have exactly the same spellings after the stem has contracted. So that's the second aorist active participle forms. Similarly, for second aorist middle voice participle forms of lepo, we see that the stem is contracted from lap to lip, and then you've just got amanas, amanu, amano, amanan, etc. It follows the exact same pattern again for present middle participle forms, whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter. And so they follow a 2-1-2 declension pattern. Second declension for masculine in terms of their case endings. First declension for feminine case endings, and second declension for the neuter in its case endings. 2-1-2 pattern for the middle voice of the second aorist. Now for second aorist passive participle forms, you'll notice that they are the same as the first aorist passive participle form, except, of course, the stem or the root is different, and they don't have the theta as a passive voice indicator. You lose the theta here, but the rest is the same. And they follow a 3-1-3 declension pattern. So third declension case endings for the masculine, first declension for the feminine, and third declension case endings for the neuter. Now that we've gotten all the fun stuff out of the way as far as how everything is formed and spellings and all of that, which I consider the nitty-gritty, but we move on to what I consider to be the more enjoyable part of all this, the meaning and the function of participles, particularly aorist participles. And the first thing I want you to note when it comes to function with aorist participles is when you're interpreting them, we need to look at them the same way we did indicative mood verbs, which we've studied to this point, in terms of emphasizing or what is emphasized, and that is aspect. Remember, Greek is an aspect prominent language. Of the three things that I told you to consider when it comes to verbs, aspect, action sart or kind of action, and time of action, looking at verbs in 3D, we need to look at verbs similarly, but the one thing that stands out that is prominent of the three is aspect. Aspect is going to be inherent to the tense form in every case with participles, just like it was true with the indicative mood tense forms that we studied already for the verbs. So, for instance, when it comes to a present tense participle form, its aspect is going to be imperfective. The writer or speaker is looking at an action, the verbal part of that participle, the action part of the participle, is viewed imperfectively as though you are in the action, you're proximate to the action, it's an internal viewpoint on the action. Future tense forms for future participles have perfective aspect. They're viewed as temporally remote or in a remote sense. And aorist tense participles, when you have that form, these are perfective in their aspect, just like with the indicative mood, and that gives you a more remote perspective. Remember the helicopter view or the balloon or the blimp perspective, looking down on a parade, you see the beginning and the end of the action, you see it as a completed whole, or in summary fashion is the idea. Now when it comes to tense forms with participles, you'll notice again there's no imperfect or pluperfect tense forms, and so we don't need to consider the aspect for those. When we get to perfect tense participles and verbs in our next lesson, I'll talk about the aspect as it pertains to perfect participles there. Now in terms of participles, we saw this last time when we studied present and future tense participle forms. Keep in mind that participles in Greek can be broken down broadly into two main types or groups: adjectival participles and adverbial participles. The adjectival participles are easier to understand, I think. And the first thing that you want to look at when you see a participle is it preceded by an article or not? Does it have an article? Is it articular or is it anarthrous? If it does have an article, that means it's going to be adjectival, because adverbial participles cannot have an article before them. They're anarthrous in every case. When it comes to adjectival participles, they're normally going to have that article. So that definite article is the first clue that you look for when you spot or identify a participle in its form. So if it has an article, then you know it's going to be adjectival for sure. And once it's adjectival, then you need to ask yourself the question, okay, is it functioning like a title, noun, or pronoun? Is it substantival, or is it attributive? Is it being used like an adjective or as a noun? In other words, as an adjective, is it modifying some other concept or truth or person or word? Now, when it is, if that's the case, then you translate it with words like who or which or that. If it's functioning substantively, then you'll want to supply words like he who or she who, or the one, the certain believing one or overcoming one, etc. And besides adjectival participles, there's also the broad grouping of adverbial participles. And they can function in a variety of ways. I've only put two types up here for you to simplify this: temporal or causal. And temporal participles are very common, but you want to go down that list of other options I gave you in the previous lesson for participles, as there's about 8 or so, maybe 9 different types of adverbial participles, and just see if any of those categories fit besides temporal participles, which are adverbial. If it is temporal, this, in terms of function, asks the question of when did the action occur? And so you're going to want to supply in your translation the words when or while or since or as, sometimes before or after, with aorist participles for after. Or sometimes it's a causal participle. It's going to ask why, in which case you supply the word because or since, etc. Let's continue our review of participles and just think for a moment about articles as they apply to participles. First of all, when you see a participle with an article, it will always be an adjectival participle. Why is that? Because only adjectival participles can have the article in front of them. And secondly, then, when you see a participle without an article, it is normally an adverbial participle. Not always, but normally. And the reason I say that is because only adjectival participles can have articles, but adjectival participles do not always occur with an article. So normally, if they don't have an article, they're going to be adverbial, but not always. They may be the rare instance of an adjectival participle that is anarthrous. Now, in terms of review with adjectival participles and cases, let's just cover this again from the last lesson. When adjectival participles modify a noun, they are functioning like an adjective. So they will almost always agree with that noun in case, gender, and number. In other words, they're going to function just like an adjective. Almost always will they agree in case, gender, and number with the word that they're modifying. Secondly, when you see a participle in one of the oblique cases, by that I mean not nominative or definitely not vocative, when you see it in the genitive, dative, or accusative case forms, it is almost always going to be an adjectival participle. That's another clue that you can look for. And thirdly, adjectival participles occur in the nominative case when they modify another nominative case word or take the place of a nominative case noun, either as a subject or a predicate nominative. So it's only logical that they would have the nominative case form. And so we've seen, in terms of our review, participles in relationship to articles, in relationship to case form endings, and now in terms of time. Just by way of review again, keep in mind the traditional rule of thumb for participles and their time of action has been this, that the participle's action or time of action is relative to the action of at least the main verb in the sentence. We know there's other more broad qualifying factors involved with the broader context, but at least for simplicity's sake, seek to identify, after you've seen the participle, try to identify the main verb in the sentence, and then you'll see the relationship between the two. Now, sometimes you'll need to go beyond the main verb in the sentence and look at the broader context. But as a general rule of thumb, what you want to do is for present tense participles, keep in mind that they're going to be, for the most part, simultaneous to the action of the main verb. When it comes to aorist tense participles, which we're learning about in this lesson, they're going to precede the action of the main verb. Now, sometimes they're going to be simultaneous with the action of the main verb, but for now, just consider, for the most part, they're going to be preceding action. And then thirdly, future tense participles are subsequent to the action of the main verb. Now here's an example of participles and relative time of action, taking a verse out of John chapter 6, the Bread of Life discourse, where it's translated, "These things he said," in reference to Jesus, "in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum." That's where the Bread of Life discourse took place, in a synagogue in Capernaum. But notice the words highlighted in yellow. You have the aorist tense form, aorist indicative apen, which comes from lego, I speak or say. And so he spoke, it's put in the past tense, it's aorist indicative, and in the context, Jesus is definitely speaking in the past from John's standpoint as the writer. But when it comes to the participle here that's used, didaskon, it's a present tense participle. So why is it translated in the past tense, he taught? Why is it not translated, he teaches or is teaching? Because again, the time of the action of the participle is relative to that of the main verb. And here the main verb is apen, which is aorist indicative, it's past tense. And so therefore, the present tense participle is simultaneous in its action to the action of the main verb in terms of timing. So it is also put in the past tense. And so that's why it's translated the way it is. Now let's move on to the aorist tense participles. Before we look at examples of verses using aorist tense participles and how they relate to their main verbs, let's just consider what Daniel Wallace says in his excellent intermediate to advanced grammar called Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. He says in regards to timing of participles, generally speaking, the tenses behave just as they do in the indicative. The only difference is that now the point of reference is the controlling verb, not the speaker. Thus, time in participles is relative or dependent. The aorist participle, for example, usually denotes antecedent time to that of the controlling verb. But if the main verb is also aorist, this participle may indicate contemporaneous time. Usually it's antecedent time. But he goes on to say the perfect participle also indicates antecedent time. We'll see that in our next lesson. And then he says the future participle denotes subsequent time. So that's a good summarizing statement from Daniel Wallace. But now we look at some examples of aorist participles used with different tenses of the main verb. In this case, we're going to look at the aorist participle in combination with a present tense main verb. And this is an example from 2 Corinthians 5:14, which translated in the New King James says, "For the love of Christ compels us, because we judge thus, that if one died for all, then all died." Now the main verb in this sentence is suneke, which could be translated compels or controls, or the Old King James, I believe, has constrains. Suneke is present tense, active voice, indicative mood, third person singular of suneko. But the participle in this case is from krino, I judge, and it's krinantas, which is an aorist active participle accusative case form. It's masculine and it's plural. But all of that to say that you've got a present tense main verb here with an aorist tense participle. And you'll notice the New King James translation has translated the participle here as a causal adverbial participle. Because we judge thus. For the love of Christ compels us because we judge thus. That's the relation between the participle and the main verb. However, the New American Standard Bible translates it having concluded this and views it more from a temporal adverbial participle standpoint. It could be translated either way. But if it is truly temporal, like the New American Standard has it, for the love of Christ controls us, having concluded this, the participle seems to be preceding the action then of controls us, or suneke. So you've got antecedent time for the participle in this case, and the thought probably was that since this is an aorist participle, it has to precede the action of the main verb, so that's why the New American Standard Bible translators translated it the way they did. Now here in Hebrews 11:11, we have an example of an aorist participle, this time with an aorist tense main verb instead of present tense main verb. So this is a clause from verse 11, and it contains an aorist participle and aorist indicative main verb. And it's in reference to Sarah. It says, because she judged him faithful who had promised. And the word judged here is our main verb. It's hegesata, aorist indicative third singular of hegeomai, meaning I judge, or it's a term of reckoning, similar to logizomai in Romans 6. She concluded, she thought, she reasoned, she judged, etc. is the idea. And the participle here is related to epangelia, meaning promise, except here it's in the participle form, epangelamenon, and it comes from epangelimai, and it's an aorist participle in this instance here. But it's articular, you'll notice, so it has the article before it, ton, epangelimenon, and because it has the article before it, it's going to be an adjectival participle. It cannot be adverbial. And it's modifying what in this case? So if it's adjectival, it's got to be modifying something. Well, it's modifying him in reference to God. And in the Greek text, there's actually not a word for him per se. It's implied in the context. The one who was counted faithful. That's what's being modified here by the participle. So for aorist participles in sentences or contexts using an aorist tense, indicative mood, main verb, you'll first want to try translating it with the participle's action preceding even the main verb. You'll often need to supply the words who had to bring this out in the translation, just like we have here in verse 11. So obviously who had are not literally in the verse 11 here. They're supplied in our English translation to give the full effect of the adjectival aorist participle here. But in terms of a time relation, you can see again that who had promised precedes Sarah's judging. And so even though you've got an aorist tense indicative mood verb for hegesata, the aorist participle is even preceding that. And bring that out in the translation when it's proper to do that. And in order to do that, you're again going to need to supply, in many cases, the phrase who had, or those words. And here's another New Testament example, this time from 2 Timothy 4, verse 10, of an aorist tense main verb with an aorist participle. And it says, in terms of translation, "For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, Here you can see from the participle for having loved that it stands antecedent to the aorist tense indicative mood main verb for forsaken. And so it's not simultaneous with the action, it's prior to it. And in this case, for the participle form, we've got agape sas, which comes from the verb agapao, I love, and it's an aorist participle here. And it is corresponding to, or relating to, the main aorist verb, aorist indicative verb for forsaken, egkatelepen, which is the aorist indicative form of egkatalepo. And so here we have, in terms of our participle, it's anarthrous, so it's not going to be adjectival, or it's not functioning adjectivally. In fact, it's functioning temporally here, having loved. And so the time of the participle's action of having loved is prior to or antecedent to the action of the main verb, which is past tense still, has forsaken, past tense. So here again, you can see that when you have an aorist participle, it's going to precede, oftentimes, normally, the action of the main verb, even if it's an aorist indicative main verb. Now I say normally, an aorist participle will precede the action of a main verb, even if it's aorist, because it doesn't always do so. And Greek scholars have recognized this for some time. That's why even 100 years ago or so, the great American Greek grammarian A.T. Robertson said in his massive Greek grammar book, one has no ground for assuming that antecedent action is a necessary or an actual fact with the aorist participle. In other words, it's not always going to be true in every case because it's inherent to aorist participles, is really what he's saying here. It may normally be true, as the case may be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. He goes on to say, the aorist participle of simultaneous action is in perfect accord with the genius and history of the Greek participle. In other words, participles are very flexible in terms of usage. So normally they're going to be antecedent in action, but sometimes they can be simultaneous in action to the main verb or thought in the sentence. This is why Buste Fanning says in his book on verbal aspect in New Testament Greek, the general pattern is clear. For example, in his study of participles in Acts, a guy named Williams concluded that of 594 instances of present participles, 518, that's 87%, reflect simultaneous occurrence. And of 588 aorist participles, 540 display antecedent occurrence. In other words, 8% of the time, he found, at least with Acts, that an aorist participle doesn't necessarily mean antecedent occurrence. It may be simultaneous occurrence. And those statistics are in line with what Kestenberger, Merkel, and Plummer write in their book Going Deeper with New Testament Greek, which is an intermediate level Greek grammar book. They say this: analysis of the adverbial participles in the Gospels of Mark and Luke demonstrates a fairly consistent pattern. About 80% of aorist adverbial participles precede the action of the main verb, and about 90% of present adverbial participles are contemporaneous with the action of the main verb. In other words, 80% of the time for Mark and Luke, the aorist participle follows the general pattern of antecedent action, and 90% of the time the present participle follows the general rule that it is contemporaneous or simultaneous with the action of the main verb. Now here we have an example in Galatians 3:13 of the normal use of the aorist participle with an aorist tense main verb. Remember, about 80% of the time, the aorist participle is going to be used to convey antecedent action, not simultaneous action. And that's the case here. As we see, it's translated, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. Now, let me just ask, when did we get redeemed? Was it after the cross, after Jesus Christ's work on the cross, or was it at the same time Christ was dying on the cross? Well, we were redeemed from our sin. Redemption was accomplished by Christ at the cross. It was made possible because of his work at the cross, but it wasn't applied to us until we individually believed and were born again or saved. Then we became identified with Christ and were saved eternally. So, has redeemed us, that's the aorist tense main verb, and it is a form of ex agorazo, I redeem. In this case, it's the aorist active indicative third person singular form of that word. It's ex ageirasen. So that's our aorist indicative main verb. But then we have an aorist participle, genomenos, which is from ginomai. And it's aorist middle participle nominative masculine singular of ginomai. So you've got an aorist participle with an aorist tense indicative mood main verb. But what is the time relation? Well, here we have a temporal adverbial participle. The time of the participle's action, excuse me, having become, it's translated, that is antecedent to the action of the main verb redeemed. Now, why do I say it's antecedent? Because Christ had to die first for us on the cross to provide redemption, but redemption was not individually applied to each one of us until we believed. And in my case, it was 2,000 years after Christ died on the cross. And so clearly we have an example here of the normal use of the aorist participle with an aorist tense main verb, where the aorist participle is conveying antecedent or prior action, even if it's an aorist indicative main verb. Now let's look at an example of the aorist participle used with a future tense indicative mood main verb. We've already looked at examples of the aorist participle used with present tense main verbs, aorist tense main verbs. Now we're going to look at future tense main verb. And the example I've chosen is John 16 verse 8, where it's clearly a context where Jesus is referring to something that will happen in the future and in reference to the Holy Spirit's coming. It says, according to the New King James, that when he has come, he will convict the world of sin and of righteousness and of judgment. Jesus Christ in this context has not died yet on the cross. That's in John 19. He hasn't risen from the dead yet. That's in John chapter 20. He hasn't ascended into heaven yet. That's Acts chapter 1. So the Holy Spirit doesn't come until Acts chapter 2. So clearly this is a future event from the time of Jesus' speaking. And it says he will convict. That word for convict there in the future active indicative form, elegke, comes from eleko. So it's future indicative. He will convict. But notice there's an aorist participle in the Greek sentence that precedes it in terms of its position in the sentence. It's elthon. That's our participle. And that's the participle that's translated either when he comes, or in the New American Standard Bible, when he comes. The New King James translates it when he has come. And elthon is also aorist. Aorist active participle. It's nominative masculine singular form of erchomai. But what's significant here is that you've got an aorist participle in relationship to a future tense main verb. And obviously, an event that's future, the aorist action has to precede that, right? You would think. But the New American Standard Bible, the way it translates it, this Holy Spirit's coming could be simultaneous with his convicting ministry. So they translate it, when he comes, he will convict. But notice the New King James adds the word has to give it more of an antecedent flavor to the convicting ministry. When he has come, i.e., that has to come first, he will convict. That's the next thing he will do. So in terms of the time relationship, again, we saw with the aorist participle that it can be, in some cases, clearly it can be used of antecedent action to that of the main verb, and sometimes it's simultaneous action to the main verb, and sometimes it's not clear, and there's room for disagreement in how it should be interpreted or translated, and we have an example of that right here. Now, having looked at participles and time of action, I want to circle back and look at the subject of verbs, not participles, but verbs in the indicative mood and their particular tense forms to reconsider this issue of time of action. You will recall that in previous studies, we've seen the present tense form, and I've mentioned that about 70% of the time, the present tense form in the indicative mood is used to describe actions that occur in present time. That means about 30% of the time, it's either going to be past action or future action, even though the present tense form is used. The same was true, or similarly, we saw with the aorist tense form that it doesn't always convey past action. The aorist indicative normally conveys past action about 85% of the time, and these are approximate figures. That means about 15% of the time, the aorist indicative is going to refer to present action or future action. Likewise, we saw with the imperfect tense form that it doesn't always refer to action in the past. It could be present time action, and it is in the minority of cases. So what all of these exceptions to the norm show us is that the time of a verb's action cannot be determined solely by a verb's tense form in the indicative mood, but by the context. So what should we conclude regarding time of action with verbs? I think this is a safe summary right here, that the time of a verb's action, whether past, present, or future, is not necessarily indicated by its tense form, except all Greek scholars seem to agree on this point. The future tense form does refer to future time. Time is inherent to the future tense form. But by other words in the context, that's how time is determined, such as adjectives, adverbs of time, and prepositional phrases. So since the present tense form is normally used for action occurring in present time, you may assume as an interpreter that a verb in the present indicative tense form is denoting present time action unless there are contextual factors indicating otherwise. Likewise, regarding the aorist tense form, since the aorist is normally used for action occurring in past time, you can assume safely that a verb in the aorist indicative is denoting past action, past time action, unless there are contextual factors indicating otherwise. And similarly, regarding the imperfect tense form, you need to look at those temporal indicators that normally it is going to be an action in past time, unless there's something in the context to convey to you that it's not past time. So just by way of review with verbs and time, the tense form of verbs always indicates aspect. That is the one constant that you can bank on every single time you see a particular tense form of a verb in the indicative mood, or frankly, even outside the indicative mood. An aorist tense form will always indicate perfective aspect, action viewed as a whole or summarily. Likewise, present tense form will always indicate, it will denote inherently, it's fixed as part of the tense form. The present tense will always indicate imperfective aspect, or action viewed internally. So the tense form always indicates aspect. It doesn't always indicate time of action. And that's why we say that Greek is an aspect prominent language. Likewise, we can conclude that tense forms in the indicative mood have tendencies and norms regarding time, but these norms can be overruled by contextual time indicators. Deictic indicators is what they're technically called. So I would say that the norms of a verb's time of action, those 70, 85, 95% patterns, those norms of a verb's time of action, they are encoded or grammaticalized in the particular tense forms in the indicative mood. And by the way, that's the current majority view among Greek scholars, and I think there's a good basis for this. I'll just give you a couple of reasons why I think that this is correct. First of all, you've got augments that go with the imperfect, first aorist, and pluperfect tense forms that are all past time in terms of action normally. Now, here's just an example of what I mean by augments again. Let's take our lexical form luo for I loose, present tense indicative mood. But notice when you've got the aorist tense, first aorist anyway, you've got an augment highlighted in light blue there, lusa. Why is that augment added to the aorist indicative here, just like it is with imperfect indicatives and pluperfect tense forms? And all of those are past time. There's an interesting article by a man named Peter Gentry, who's a Greek language scholar here in the United States. And he has demonstrated, I believe, correctly, that down through the history of Greek usage up to the time of Koine Greek, the augment sort of evolved and became a fixed part of the language to indicate past time. And so you can show that historically. And here's a second reason why I believe the norms of a verb's time of action are encoded or grammaticalized in the particular tense forms in the indicative mood. Because sometimes passages use, or writers use, in certain passages a tense form that seems time specific. For example, in John 8, verse 58, the Jews are contending with the Lord Jesus, and Jesus says to them, "Most assuredly, I say to you that before Abraham was, I am." And he uses the ego eimi expression there. And what do? They take up stones to stone him because they recognize that he's claiming to be the I am who I am of the Old Testament, none other than Yahweh God himself. But notice here that he uses the present tense form of eimi, the present indicative of eimi. He had available to him the option to use the imperfect tense form of eimi, imperfect indicative, and he could have said, before Abraham was, I was, showing prior existence to Abraham. But prior existence wouldn't be enough to show that he is the one true God. He could have been an angel, let's say, who preceded Abraham. But in fact, he not only preceded Abraham, he preceded the angels. He was none other than the creator of all, the one true God, the God of Israel, Yahweh or Jehovah God. And so the choice between the perfect indicative of eimi and the imperfect indicative here seems very significant. And why would the writer John or the Lord Jesus speaking have this distinction? It's obviously very theologically significant. Well, that's because I believe that time is indicated by particular tense forms in the indicative mood, at least normally so. Now, having looked at the subject of time and tense forms in the indicative mood for verbs, I want to shift back to participles and introduce at this point a brand new subject that you haven't been taught before, but because we're on the topic of participles, it's relevant. And it is the subject of the genitive absolute construction. This is a construction that's quite common in the New Testament. I believe it occurs over 300 times. So it is something that you will encounter and you need to at least be aware of. So let me explain it for you. Actually, before we look at the genitive absolute, I want you just to see the normal case construction with participles first, and then we'll contrast it with the genitive absolute, and I think that'll make it clear for you. First of all, let's look at a normal example of case usage with participles. Matthew 9, verse 2. Seeing their faith, Jesus said to the paralytic, "Take courage, son, your sins are forgiven." We have the participle there, idon, which is translated seeing, and then you have the subject of that participle, Jesus, ha Jesus, and notice what case form the subject Jesus is in. It's in the nominative case form. So this is not going to be a case of a genitive absolute construction, which uses the genitive case for subjects, because here we have the nominative case. So here Jesus is nominative. He is the subject who's doing the seeing and doing the action of said, apen, later in the sentence, Jesus said. So the participle seeing, which is idon, is put in the nominative case because it goes with the subject who's doing the action. So pretty simple. But here's an example of a genitive absolute construction, which is used when an author wants to give background information or describe a concurrent action that involves a different subject. And when that's the case, the genitive case is used. It's used in one clause to distinguish the subject of the participle from the subject of the main verb in the sentence. That's the reason why genitive absolute constructions occur. So here we have in John 8, verse 30, as he spoke these things, many believed in him. So as he spoke is going to be our participle. Here the subject of the main clause is many, paloi, and the main verb is believed, epistusan, aorist active indicative. So the subject is many, the main verb is believed, but notice the subject of spoke, laluntas, that's our participle. The subject is he in reference to Jesus. And what case is it in? It's in the genitive case. Autu is genitive case, and so what case is the participle in? It is also in the genitive case. So both use the genitive case in this instance here of the genitive absolute construction to make that phrase, as he spoke these things, to make that entirely separate from the rest of the sentence that has your main subject and main verb. It sets it apart, in other words, and it doesn't confuse the subject of the participle's action with the subject of the main verb in the sentence. So Greek does this quite frequently. And here are just some basic points for you to be aware of regarding the genitive absolute. It's not that these are critical, that you're going to be tested on these things, hint, hint, but you should just be aware of them and be familiar with this. A genitive absolute is a special use of the adverbial participle that occurs 312 times in the New Testament, and it provides background information or describes concurrent action. It is said to be quote-unquote absolute because it is not grammatically dependent on the rest of the sentence. In fact, it's separate from that portion. And the genitive case is used to distinguish the subject of the participle from the subject of the main verb, which is normally going to be nominative. So those are some points to keep in mind. And these are going to be some characteristics of genitive absolute constructions. First of all, the participle and its subject are going to be in the genitive case, hence its name, genitive absolute. The participle is always adverbial. It's not going to be adjectival. It's not going to function adjectively or attributively or substantively. It's going to be adverbial, and it will therefore be anarthrous. That's another good clue to look for. Genitive and anarthrous. Thirdly, the participle is usually temporal, meaning you're going to want to supply when, while, since, or as part of your interpretation or translation. Fourthly, the construction is often at the beginning of a sentence, just like we saw in the previous example with John 8, verse 30. Another point is that the construction occurs most often in narratives. It's a feature of use that's usually most often used by more advanced writers, though John uses it sometimes, not nearly as frequently as Luke, who wrote Luke and Acts, and many people say he also wrote Hebrews. There's a very strong defense of that position, an entire book that's come out on that subject. But this seems to be a feature of an advanced style of writing. Another point to keep in mind is that not all genitive participles are genitive absolutes. So just because you see a participle that uses the genitive, don't automatically assume that you're dealing with a genitive absolute. And lastly, the genitive absolute is sometimes used to emphasize or highlight something unexpected. So it's used for emphasis, and particularly a turn or a twist in the thought of the normal reader that brings out something that is unexpected. For example, in Romans 5, verses 6 and 8, we see two instances of this genitive absolute construction. And the reason Paul seems to be using it is to, again, present something that kind of jars the reader and presents a theologically significant example here of something Jesus did for us and God's grace towards us. It says in verse 6, "For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly." The main verb, of course, is died. The subject is Christ. And so you see Christos as the subject and nominative case form, and apathenon is the main verb. So Christ died, underlined there. But the participle construction starts with anton, hemon, asthenon. Asthenon is the term that's used for without strength, and anton would be the amy form of the participle, and it's a present participle. But notice it's all in the genitive case. And the reason for that, again, is this is a genitive absolute. And so the entire phrase, "when we were without strength," is set apart in the sentence as a genitive absolute construction to separate it from the main subject and verb, which is Christ died. So it stands alone, and it almost stands out to you as a reader that Christ died when we were without strength. He didn't die for us while we were doing really well spiritually. Thus, verse 7 goes on to say, "For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die." In verse 8, "But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." So in verse 8 we see a subject and a verb. God demonstrates. We also see a subject and a verb. Christ died again, just like in verse 6. But set apart from those two independent clauses, God demonstrates his own love toward us and Christ died for us. Set apart from that is this genitive absolute construction, while we were still sinners, or just sinners. So you've got hamartalon, anton, hemon. Hamartalon, anton, hemon. Anton is your participle there. Again, present participle of amy, and still being sinners. Christ didn't die for us because, again, we were doing so well spiritually. How does God demonstrate his love toward us? Not in a deserving or meritorious way, but he gives us what we don't deserve. He died for sinners, not for those who are really righteous, as verse 7 said. So here you've got two uses again of the genitive absolute. It follows the characteristics that we saw. In fact, both in verse 8 and verse 6, it's a temporal adverbial participle usage, and it fits the qualifications for this genitive absolute. So just be aware of this construction. It can sometimes be quite theologically significant. Finally, as we conclude this lesson on aorist participles, I want to just mention that in some of your workbooks, there may be a typo for chapter 22 and translation exercise number 20. At least there is in my edition, and I have a revised workbook and it's still there. But you may notice that it says legantes autou, and that's supposed to be a genitive absolute construction, and so it should be legantas autou. The way it's written now, legantes, is a nominative plural present active participle. It's supposed to be legantas, present active, genitive masculine singular, so big difference. And the way it should be translated, I'll just give you the answer here, as he spoke these things, or could be while he spoke these things, he saw the truth of God's love, or the truth of the love of God. So it's a temporal participle being used as a genitive absolute construction. So I just want to give you that tip or heads up so that you don't spend hours working on this and pull your hair out and think there must be something wrong. So just to let you know that, and that wraps up our lesson on genitive absolute as well as the aorist participle usage and forms.